He nore ki te atua, mongorongo ki te whenua, whakara pai ki ngā tangata katoa, kouta mihi tuatahi ki tō mātua e te rangi. Ko rangiuri te maunga, ko Katuna te awa, ko Himalaya te waka, ko Waitangi te kawanata, ko Ihu Karaiti te tangata me te atua ti hei mauri ora. Glory to God, peace on earth and goodwill to all people. Acknowledge our Father in heaven amongst us today, and where I come from and where my wife Jeannie and I come from, down in the Bay of Plenty in the rohe of Tapuika. We live on a orchard which has the boundary of a river called the Kaituna that some of you have swum in, and just over the river is a mountain called Rangiuru. My ancestors came on a waka called the Himalaya in 1867, and I am a person who acknowledges the treaty and find my tūranga waiwai within the treaty, and a place to stand, which we all have, which is a wonderful privilege. Kei te mihi ki te rārangi maunga o tēnei rohi. Ki a tātou, te hunga ora e noho kei Wanganui i ngā pitapito o ēnei maunga me ngā whangā o Waitamata me te manakau, ko tēnei te mihi ki a koutou. Just acknowledging the people of this area and the different mountains and the harbours of on which Tamaki Makaurau sits. Ka huri atu ki te haukainga, ki te whare karakia edge. Kei a koe, Jay, mō tō manaakitanga ki a mātou e tēnei wā, mō tō arawa hoki, ko tēnei te mihi ki a koe, ki a koutou katoa. Just acknowledging this place here, this place of edge, and acknowledging their hospitality to us this morning for looking after us. Ka huri atu ki te kaupapa te wā, te ropu o Karuwhā, ki a koe, Sam, tēnā koe. I want to acknowledge Sam this morning. He's a very special person, I think, within the framework of not only the church, but within the development of the stories of our land. And it just seems that the seasons, you know, there are lots of seasons in God in which we live, and God seems to emphasize certain things at certain times, and I don't think you need to be highly sensitive to understand that somehow the spotlight of the Spirit of God is upon our land and the stories that are within our land, and leading us to encounter those stories, and as a response to that, know what to do with these stories. And Sam is, I think, a person who's certainly been appointed for the hour. He's a young man who I think has a lot more to contribute to our nation. So kia koe, te mana, Sam. Kia koutou katoa ngā mata waka kei Wanganui i a tātou e tēnei wā, from people who belong to the different tribes amongst us. Ki ngā tangata tiriti hoki, to you Pākehā, me ngā haue whā, nau mai haere mai, whakatau mai ki konei. Just want to acknowledge my good friend Bill Heald, the Reverend Bill Heald. Thank you for coming, Bill. Bill is a long-time sojourner with Jeannie and me in this land, and has a real heart for revival, and has lived up in the north, up in Kaitaia, where we saw some beautiful things happening amongst tangata whenua there and the gospel. And so, Bill, it's lovely to see you here this morning. And another good friend, James Muir from Tauranga Moana, who, James on the left here, we work together in a group called Te Kohinga, which is a reconciliation network in Tauranga, where we're seeking for many years now to make friends out of our local story. And there's some wonderful things that are happening down there amongst leaders of iwi and church leaders as we grow in our relationship together with each other and seek, as I said, to reconcile the past, that we might make progress together in going forward. I think I'm number 3 choice this morning. We did try to get some really exciting speakers for you this morning, but they were otherwise engaged. So I am very grateful for the opportunity to be with you this morning, and I hope that what I've got to offer you has some interest to you. I think you're the hardcore. You are a special group that would want to come out on a Saturday morning and listen to this kind of stuff. So I really just pray God's blessing upon you, that in your own personal, family journeys that you're making in this stuff, that you will be blessed. It's a bit of a mixture of what I've got in response to Sam's invitation. I'm going to talk a lot about the Parihaka story itself, and I'm going to, in a sense, I've approached it from the perspective that you don't know a lot about it, and excuse me if you already know a lot. This is just revision time, so I felt that was the best way to approach it. So I'm going to be talking and using someone else's presentation, which I'll come to in a minute, to tell about the journey of Māori to Parihaka. And I want to try and weave into that something of my journey into Parihaka as well, and then the greater umbrella, I guess, kaupapa around that is this idea of hohorongo, or reconciliation. So we start off with this beautiful verses and lines that come really initially from the book of Luke, when the message of the angels came to the shepherds about the announcement of the birth of Jesus. And interestingly enough, these 3 verses have now become what's called a tauparapara, which is, you'll hear it all up and down the land when kai kōrero, when speakers get up in the marae, they will often get up and talk and begin their kōrero with this, he anōre ke te atua, just as I did this morning. This is a saying that in some sense encapsulates the ethos or kaupapa of Parihaka, and it's actually spread throughout the land and has been picked up by a lot of people, not always understanding why, but that's interesting that it's embedded within our land at the moment. So it's a beautiful thing. So Parihaka, it needs a little bit of background explanation, and the story of Parihaka really begins in the 1860s. That's when its genesis as a village came about. But the background to it is that the background was the arrival of my ancestors. As I said in my pepeha, my ancestors came in 1867, part of this mass migration to the land. And they came with this extraordinary promise of, there's as much land as you want, come and get it. That was really the advertisements that were in Britain at the time. By the New Zealand Company and others, and so this place was really advertised as this great open land, and it's there, you just have to come and get it. So that a lot of dispossessed people really came to Aotearoa, New Zealand. My ancestors, Alistair Reese, was one of those. He was a builder's and steel worker kind of apprentice as a 19-year-old living just on the outside of Glasgow, without any hope really of being able to own land or to make any progress, within the social structures of the time. So he, with his other brothers and sisters, migrated out to New Zealand, and ultimately he became a surveyor and landowner at Pahiatua. But my family story represents a wider story among thousands and thousands of Europeans who came into the land with the demand for that land. So we know that the Treaty of Waitangi was signed in 1840, and one of the promises of the Crown to the treaty to Māori around that treaty was that they would preserve their land and look after the land for Māori. That was one of the second clause of the treaty. But what happened was that the Crown came under increasing pressure from the settlers to say, we want land. We want land, and that was kind of like you could say that was the mantra. And so that demand for land caused a lot of consternation amongst Māori. The other thing was this tension between the Treaty of Waitangi and the autonomous self or the governorship that Māori had over their own lives, this manu motuhake, this issue of what is or tino rangatiratanga, what does rangatiratanga look like in the context of post-treaty times. So those were major issues. The land and the issue of autonomy were post-1840. And we saw the rise, for example, of kingitanga in the 1860s, and the rise of a man called the first king Potatota Wherowhero, who was appointed king in 1858. And there was, Te Wherowhero, like a lot of Māori leaders at the time, embraced Christianity into their own world, and that world was what we would call a very prophetic world. And I will talk a little bit about that today within the Parihaka story. But one of the things that Te Wherowhero said in 1860, around the time when the land question and this issue of governorship was emerging, he spoke these words. He says, "Whāta mana ki te hauru, kei kona ngā manu mohi o e rua, ko te mumuhau te tahi, ko terato ke tahi, kei koina te ara ki te maramatanga." He said, follow the birds to the west. Their names are mumuhau and their name is kerato. And he said, that is the way to understanding. So the west, or Te Hauru, is the land really of Taranaki, that big thing that sticks out on the west coast. And in a sense, what Te Wherowhero is saying is prophesying to his people, there will come some understanding out of this west land for our people who are in the midst of this confusion and this trouble. Interestingly enough, just a little aside, the mumuhau and kerato were the names of the two birds that came with Te Arawa Waka and guided Ngā Toirangi, who was the navigator tohunga on that waka, teaching them how to find land, etc. And so that story of these birds stayed embedded within the narrative of the land. You can do with that as you will. I will refer to the birds again a bit later. So we have this issue of the land where the demand came upon the crown to actually satisfy an insatiable appetite of the settlers for the land. And the result was that it led to conflict, and I'm going to really skip through some very important stuff here, but just for the sake of an overview, one of the major flashpoints was in Taranaki at a place called Waitara, and over some tensions over the sailing of the land there, and as a result some skirmishes broke out. Really, you would say the battles in Taranaki were the first battles of the land wars, apart from there were some outbreaks of course up north as well, but that was signalling the major skirmishes that went on for the next, particularly the next 5 years. As a result of those skirmishes, the Crown instituted some legislation, and one of them particularly was the New Zealand Settlements Act, and then the Rebellion Act, and as a result of those, thousands or hundreds of thousands of acres were confiscated, and people were dislocated not only so much from the physical occupation of the land, but were dislocated in the sense of their rangatiratanga, or this manu motuhake, the sense that they were able to make the decisions about their own welfare, future on the land that they traditionally had occupied. And so we have big movements around this, particularly this North Island region of Māori, who, as I said, were either displaced through warfare or displaced through their leaders being taken from them, or displaced because their homelands was no longer the place where they could exercise their mana whenua. And it's out of that background that two significant men arose. Ngā manu e rua, the two birds they were referred to, Te Whiti o Rongomai and Tohu Kākahi. So these two men were young rangatira who were just, I guess, raising up at the time of that early warfare in 1860, when Titaka Waru and others like that, and Wiramukingi were involved in warfare, and they basically gathered people around them. And that's the story I want to tell today about their gathering of the people to Parihaka, how that happened and what that looked like. In one sense, what I would like to do is to frame the story of Parihaka around the prophetic insight of Te Whiti o Rongomai. And early on, Te Whiti had a prophetic vision, and he spoke out that the development of Parihaka, or the people of Parihaka, would be in four stages, or there would be four significant events that would take place. The first one is Te Taua Te Takahanga, the year of the trampling, Akaldama, Tūpapaku, and Te Aranga, which means the resurrection. So, and we will talk some more about, as some of us believe, that there was an accuracy to Whiti's prophesying around these things. And particularly the Tūpapaku and the Te Aranga, or the death of the vision and the day of resurrection. I'm going to head forward just to give you an idea of what Parihaka looked like in the 1960s, and I've associated it with the Te Tūpapaku, or the death. So these are two photos of what Parihaka really looked like in 1963, and the significance of this will be made more clear as we go into the story. But really, in 1963, it was an abandoned village mainly, with just a few people who were left behind. So my first visit to Parihaka was in 1978, and my entrance to Parihaka was through these three people. The first one is a man called Vivian Hutchinson. Vivian calls himself a social entrepreneur, and he lives in Taranaki, been a long time worker around the area of the poor, workers' rights, and particularly the area of Māori. And so Vivian was just a young man. This is a recent photo of him. He was a young man in New Plymouth in the 70s, and he made friends with this significant woman whom we called Auntie Marge, or Marge 3 Raukupa. And Auntie Marge was the kaitiaki of Tiniho, and the first person over on the right is a man called Timuringa Hohaia, who was the one who started up the peace festivals. And Timuringa and Auntie Marge were, in some sense, like the one of that remnant of the Parihaka residents in the 1970s. Timuringa lived just down the road on the coast in a little whare down there, and Auntie Marge lived in New Plymouth, but she would come down to Parihaka every 18th and 19th. Now the 18th and the 19th are the days of the month that they commemorate and gather together, which has been going unbroken now for 160 years. So they gather as a people in the three marae, Tinuho, Te Paipai, and Toroanui on the 18th and the 19th. And Auntie Marge and two other aunties, auntie called Auntie Ina and Auntie Netta, and then actually another one called Auntie Sally. They almost alone stood, particularly in Tinioho or Te Atiawa, which is the house of Te Whiti o Rongamai, in those 1970s, and believed for an aranga, believed for a resurrection of this land that had been deserted. And so she teamed up with this man called Vivian Hutchinson, and really the only, I guess, male stalwart she had with her was this man called Te Miringa Hohaia, who was just a young radical at the time. And I was invited down with a group of friends. I was living in Auckland at the time, playing music in a band in pubs and stuff, and I had just returned back from overseas from being away for about 10 years, and I was in my late 20s, typical Pākehā who had been raised in a Pākehā world who knew nothing about Te Ao Māori or the Maori world. So these friends of mine took me down at the invitation of Vivian Hutchinson. We arrived at Tinuho to be greeted by Auntie Marge and the other two aunties and Te Miringa Hohaia, and they, as some of you will know, the kawa there is that you walk into a house or into the marae, and instead of having a whai kōrero outside, you just walk straight in and you hongi. They greet you with a karanga and a hongi right there in the house, which is a type of greeting or a way of doing it which is quite particular to Parihaka. So I would just want to tell this little story. I was so naive about this Māori world and what you do. I'd grown up knowing about hongi, but we grew up just, in a sense, making fun of it, and we would just rub each other's noses like this as kids. That's what I thought was a hongi. So here I go, barging into Tinioho, and these beautiful old ladies standing in there, waiting for, with a karanga, and I just go up and I go, I'm the first lady. And this, anyway, we went through everything. They never said anything. Took me out the back. Auntie Ina says, just put her arms around me and says, oh. And she explained to me that that's not exactly the way that you do a hongi. This is what it looked like when I arrived in 1978, and here again is Tinuho, which has been slightly restored from the 1960s photograph. I put a question mark around Te Aranga, which actually is the Māori word for Easter or for resurrection, the prophecy, because it was at that time that Auntie Marge began to invite the students of the world or the young of the world to come to Parihaka. It was as though even within Māori there was not a passion for what was happening there, but there was this growing passion amongst inquiring young Pākehā, and so they embraced us, from as the ragtail mob that we were, and we used to go there quite a lot, and we'd do all kinds of stuff there and do music, and they began to teach us about the story of Parihaka. And I just have put this word aranga with a question mark beside it, saying that it's in the 70s that I'm sensing that the renaissance of Parihaka has began. And it's that story which we'll finish up with today. But what I've thought to do was, that's given you something of the background. I want to give to you now something of, it's the story of Parihaka as told by Auntie Marge and Vivian Hutchinson. Te Whiti and Tohu arose as I began out of the context of the day when the trials of the land issue and mana motuhake, the need for autonomy, that was one of the motivations. They grew up, though, in this bicultural world of Te Ao Māori and Te Rongopai. Like many other Christian leaders of the time, they were deeply influenced by the gospel. And there were a couple of people that were key leaders in that. There was a Wesleyan missionary called Raymond Schneider, and also a local indigenous Atiawa leader called Minarapa, who had been captured by Waikato Tainui, taken up to Tainui, and then captured again by Ngāpuhi, and taken up to Northland, and like many of the other people who had been taken up to Ngāpuhi during the 1820s and that during the Musket Wars, came in contact with the gospel and came back down afterwards to Wellington and then moved up to Taranaki. And the thought is that both Tohu and Te Whiti, who were taught by Raymond Schneider, were also taught by Minirapa to read and to inculcate their understanding of the gospel into their own lives. So they are people who walk in this world. They walked in that world trying to make sense of who they were and what this new message was coming from Europe. So as we've said, they have created this village of Parihaka, or this community of Parihaka, and they basically put a call, a karanga out to the motu to say, no mai hari mai ki tēnei kaupapa, te kaupapa o he nore ki te ata mangarongo ki te whenua whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. And it was a place welcoming of all people. And as Auntie Marge and Vivian said in that slideshow there, people came from Ngāpuhi, and particularly a big contingent came from Tainui, Ngāti Ruanui, Te Atiawa also collected at Parihaka and had their places there. So it was one of the unique settlements in the land that was not organised upon whakapapa, but it was actually organised upon kaupapa. And that actually impinges right now in the present day in the terms of who they are as a community, how they're relating to the Crown, what's happening with the Crown, and how do they progress as a people. And they're having discussions at this very time of who are the people who are the Parihaka people. Are they the ones that are based upon the whakapapa of the people that were there originally, or are they the people they call the followers of Te Whiti o Rongomai? The other thing that interests me as a Christian was these, the tohu, the signs that came in the midst of their establishment of the community. And there's stories, and there's lots of different stories from different quarters of things that have happened. And you have the appearance of people like Melchizedek, Gabriel, Michael, and the appearance of albatross who come to the marae. And for example, this albatross that arrived as a sign of the speaking of Melchizedek drops his feathers on the marae at Toroanui and then takes off, which is a complete impossibility because albatross actually can't take off from land. They have to take off from a cliff, but dropped their feathers onto the marae there, and the marae there of Tohu is actually called Toroanui, which means the albatross. And the stories around what happened at the battle, at the invasion itself. The beautiful. This is some of you might, if you're travelling down the number 1 highway. This is at Waihi, the marae Waihi at the King's Marae at Huntly. There's a carving there with a dog on the carving, and that signifies what happened. They didn't mention it on the slideshow there, but one of the main stories is that the dog peed on the cannon. And therefore they were not able to fire the cannon over the village. And so that's signified within that story. So there's lots of, I'm sure some of them are apocryphal, but there's enough there to actually suggest that these people experience supernatural signs from God that led them into this kaupapa. What I would like to say to underscore that, I don't think we understand really the significance of a movement of people that move from a place of violence as a means of defending rights. And I mean violence if there's a good sense, I mean self-defense. And moved into this place where they used passive resistance of using the ploughing, the building of the fences, way before people like Mahatma Gandhi or any of these other people had ideas of passive resistance as a means of solving issues. But they attracted people like Te Tokowaru, who was known as the warrior chief of Taranaki, and Te Whetū and people like that who came to Parihaka and were swayed by whatever to actually change their complete worldview and their way of life into accepting that there was another way. So there was something profound that was taking place there, and that Tawhiti and Tohu were able to ensure that or control that kaupapa actually existed, and so that against all the provocations that came to their people, that was not broken. And here's just a few sayings of Tawhiti and Tohu. When asked by the ploughman, what should we do if one of us is shot as we're ploughing up, as Tawhiti says, the belly of the crown, and Tohu says, gather up the earth on which the blood is spilt and bring it to Parihaka. No good thing has ever been wrought by force. There is no reason why force should continue to have power over us. One of the sayings of Tawhiti. Parihaka in the Waiata has been referred to by Tawhiti and Tohu as the Ark. And it's in this is quite an extraordinary Waiata, which I've been involved with sort of processing with one of the kaumātua there, a man called Ruakiri Hond, who's one of the holders of the Waiata there. And trying to understand the symbols behind the language of the Waiata. But this Waiata here is one of the few Waiata that actually talks about this one here, Hei whāriki ake mō ihu karaite te uri o Rāwiri, talking about Jesus Christ, who was a descendant of David, and talking about the place of the Spirit in the Ark, which is the place of at Parihaka, referring to Noah. And then there's some talking here about the Wairua. So this was can I just give you an example here? We've been going through this Waiata, and they're perplexed about the meaning of this. For example, ki te tokowaru o Noah, the eight of Noah. What is that referred to? And I was able to help them with this to understand that this is referring to the eight of the family of Noah who came on board the ark. And then down here it talks about about the nine. So what is the nine? The Wairua, the nine of the Wairua referred to. E haere a Wairua mai e te pō, ngā kupu, ngā mahi. So the nine of the Spirit, I'm thinking, is to do with either the gifts of the Spirit, the manifestations of the Spirit, or the fruit of the Spirit. So these Waiata are really very useful in trying to continue this conversation around the gospel, which I'll refer to again. Tawhiti talks about the ark by which we are to be saved today is stout-heartedness, and flight is death. There is nothing about fighting today but the glorification of God and peace on the land. Let us wait for the end. There is nothing else for us. Let us abide calmly on the land. That's just a few days prior to the invasion on November the 5th. Mindful of time, I just want to refer back again to these prophecies of Tawhiti that I spoke about. So the first one was the year of the trampling, and they referred to a time in 17th of March in 1869. 17th of March was the day of the outbreak of war in Waitara, and basically that was the year, nearly 10 years later, when Tawhiti and Tohu decided, after trying for many years to negotiate with the Crown, that enough was enough, that they rejected the authority of the Crown and said, no, we will continue to establish our own authority. So that was what they called the year of the trampling. And then in 1878, what happened was there was a gathering of many chiefs, Ngati Maniapoto, Tainui chiefs, together at Waitara, and it was kind of like a negotiation with the Crown, with these chiefs, and there was a bit of controversy around payment by the Crown to these chiefs, etc. And what Te Whiti and Tohu said, that they felt that was a betrayal. So Te Whiti designated that as the year of Akaldama, which is, Akaldama is the Akarama, or the Akaldama, the time when Judas took the bags of silver and betrayed Jesus. And he said that year, that has happened within our land, and we will have to, we had no part of that compromise with the Crown. So that was their take on that, and they, in a sense, stood alone around those issues. As I said, finally, the tūpapaku, which means the body, the dead body, the corpse. This death of the vision began on November the 5th in 1881 with the invasion of Bryce coming onto the pa, and the desecration of the land, the desecration of the people. Auntie Marge didn't mention about the rape and the syphilis that arose, the stealing of the taonga and the expulsion of the non-Taranaki people. But even though the pa didn't die at that time, that is referred to as tūpapaku. So as it says that Te Whiti and Tohu died in 1907, there's some beautiful inscriptions on the monument there in Te Whiti's gravestone there by Charlie Waitara, who was a very strong Christian. He talks there, Charlie talks there about the gospel and on the inscription there, you can read it if you go there. But he says, let this be clearly understood by all Māori. This is what he said at the death of Te Whiti, Pākehā and all other nations. The white feather is a sign that all nations will be one, black, red and all others who are called human beings. The feather will be the sign of unity, prosperity, peace and goodwill. So like a lot of what we would call the millenarian prophets of the 19th century, they were reaching into the Isaianic prophecies and the Micah prophecies about the Christ as the and as being the Prince of Peace, and people standing under the vines and enjoying peace and prosperity and that kind of thing. They were reaching into those kinds of particularly Old Testament narratives to understand the possibilities of who they could be as a people. So that informed a lot of their own direction. I want to finish now and just in a short section, sort of in a sense, linking my own story back into the Parihaka story. I began with saying how I, in a sense, bumbled into Parihaka in 1978 as this very naive Pākehā who knew nothing. I was actually not a Christian at the time, and but I became extraordinarily enamoured with Te Ao Māori, and I really thought that the salvation of the land lay in the marae and what happened there. Cut a long story short, I became a Christian in 1979, and I went to Faith Bible College with my good friend Brett, sitting there with the grey hair. So good to see you, Brett. Just a little brief interlude here. So I had been associated with kind of political activism right through the 70s, Vietnam, and I'd sailed up into Mururoa and all of those sorts of stuff, and then into Te Ao Māori. And then I became a Christian in a kind of a revivalist setting, and hit the wall there a bit because many said to me that there is no relationship between your experience of Christ and these social struggles, and particularly with Te Ao Māori, and that needs to be cut. So went through a period of confusion. As I was working through my theology, there was no doubting the experience of the Spirit and what it did to me as a person, but I struggled with actually making sense of how that operated in the real world outside of church gatherings and my own personal search for holiness. in that time, I would go down to Parihaka just very occasionally, maybe once a year or so, and I would have encounters with Timaringa, who would continue to be an activist, radical spokesman, leader for Parihaka, and he would challenge me about, well, yeah, it's all very well, this Jesus stuff, but what are you doing with it? What change are you making on the ground? Where are the poor? What are you doing with it, etc., etc.? And I would, having gone down there trying to spread the word, I'd come back with my tail between my legs, feeling like actually that there was a widow that I really didn't have an answer to. And so I would continue that occasional visit to Parihaka. And then in 2000, I think it was around 2001, my cousin and good friend Graham Carley, who in a very separate journey had made a connection with Parihaka because he had married to a woman called Trudy and Trudy, she was a Trudy Love, who was a Love family with the Te Atiawa family, and he, through his wife, discovered the story of Parihaka. Like most of us, knew nothing about it, went to Parihaka and had somewhat of an epiphany for what that this story needs to go into the land. And not only that we should mark the story with Parihaka Day, which is changing Guy Fawkes Day on November the 5 to become a Parihaka Day. So he knew of my association with Parihaka, so he invited me to come back, and so I, in a sense, returned, and the entrance into Parihaka this time, which had been originally through Vivian and Auntie Marge. Auntie Marge had become quite old and ill at this time and had moved back to New Plymouth and was very seldom there. Vivian had stopped coming regularly, and the only one that I had a continual relationship with was Timaringa. And then through Graham, I met these two significant people, a man called Turu Parihaka, who is a woman who's Mata's husband. And many of you have met Mata. Mata is the kaitiaki of Aotearoa, and Turu was one of the senior kaumātua at Parihaka. And with these two, we began to plan and talk more about the Parihaka Day idea. And over many years now, we've been talking and planning and seeking to progress this idea that Parihaka Day should be commemorated. Unfortunately, Turu died several years ago, and we lost a significant leader there, but Mata is still really, as many of you will have acknowledged, is larger than life, even though she too is actually suffering major health battles at the moment. The other, I just probably should say that Mata married, Mata is from Tainui and also Ngāti Parihaka of Tauranga. She came to Taranaki to marry Turu and in order to continue his bloodline. And so his bloodline has been now passed, this is Te Ako, his oldest son, and they have daughters as well, and Te Ako is now the main kai kōrero on Tinuho. That's sitting outside of their whare doing some weaving. This man here, who's become a very good friend, is Rangi Kotoku, is married to Ngāraiti. He's the kaumātua at Tinuho, which is Tohu's marae. If it hasn't been made clear, there are actually three marae at Parihaka. There's Tinuho Te Atiawa, there's Te Paipai, and they're both Te Whiti marae, and then there's Toroanui, which is Tohu's marae, which is led by this man. I would say that this man now, Ruakiri Hond, who is the kai kōrero at Te Paipai, is, in my view, probably the most influential leader in Parihaka at the moment. He replaced Timaringa after he died. Timaringa died suddenly a few years ago, and Ruakiri, who I said earlier, he's one of the leaders in the preservation of the dialect of Taranaki reo, and also of their waiata, and also the main leader in the negotiation with the Crown. So this 15 years ago, jumped back on the waka and accepted the challenge, I guess, in terms of my confusion around a revival Christianity and the gospel and social justice. And I've put that to bed, although there's still lots of questions, theological questions around that, but following my heart that the two are not mutually exclusive, that somehow needs to be an expression of the gospel in the world in which we live, because noi hota whenua me oni tini me te ao mā ngā tangata katoa. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it belongs to Him, that He's vitally interested in every single thing. So one of the things that I also ask God for, ngā tohu, for the signs to say, are you on the right track? And some years ago, my daughter Naomi, that some of you will know, graduated from Otago University. And you heard on the slideshow that many of Parihaka people were imprisoned down in Dunedin. And there's a monument just on the outskirts of Dunedin. I'm not very familiar with Dunedin, so I can't tell you exactly what it is, but it's right by the esplanade by the ocean. And the roadsides were all built by the Parihaka prisoners. And there's this, they call it the rongo stone, or a place of a memorial of peace. And Naomi took me out there one day, and I just actually, the few days before, had come from Parihaka, and as I do, I was just talking to God in my own heart and saying, is this really this stuff? Is this really just you and all that? And I said this to Naomi, and we were talking about it, and she said, look, Dad, and I looked up behind me, and this is the cliffs up behind the rongo. And some of you might be able to see just up in here a little white dove. And I just felt, it was God speaking to me saying, this is, not only is it it's a dove, but the representation of the dove and the ark and peace and all of that. And so I've taken that as a continued encouragement that this hiding, this journey down here is a God thing. The other thing that I've been very encouraged by recently is that James and I have been doing a lot of work in Tauranga around the stories down there. And one of the wonderful stories that come out of that is of Henry Williams, Karuwhā, whom this group is named after, Four Eyes. And I don't think we really understand the incredible distances and sacrifice that Henry Williams went through in his establishment of his relationship with Māori. He arrived here in 1826. Between 1814 and 1830, there were only 2 baptisms, right? So from 1814 at least to 1830, that's how many years is that? That's 16 years, is it? Yeah, 16 years CMS missionaries laboured, and only 2 people were convinced of their claims. But in the midst of that time, after his arrival in 1826, one of the key preoccupations of Henry Williams was actually getting to know the people amongst whom he lived, learning the language and their tikanga. But even more significantly was that the relationship that he developed with them brought him into a place of mana with the local people. And one of the things that Henry Williams did, and many others did, was actually become involved in peacemaking in the difficulties between the different hapu and iwi. And this is a painting of Henry Williams, of him sailing down with the Ngāpuhi Whakataua as they were on their musket raids. And so this is the active schooner sailing. So he sailed down with them as these guys were coming down from north to, wreak havoc with the muskets, and engaging with conversation, imploring them, saying there's another way, etc. And he made several trips with these toa, and it was ultimately his, as a result of this endeavours, for example, just in Tauranga, amongst local iwi, that they saw his labour for peace, that they invited him and the others to establish a CMS mission station in Tauranga. So This went on for many, many years before those of us who are evangelistic in our desires could be satisfied with the fruit in terms of whatever. So, personally, Parihaka has been for me a tremendous privilege, and firstly, it was my entrance into our Māori, and as I said, these folk invited us in, this ragtail mob, and say, just come and be here. One of the things it's done, of course, that journey has just raised heaps of questions for me, and on many ways made my life uncomfortable. It's made Jeannie and my life uncomfortable because it's 5.5 hours drive to Parihaka, and most months now I make the journey down there to these 18th and the 19th. It's made it uncomfortable theologically because I find myself in the midst of the people who are honouring Te Atua I Rungarawa and trying to find a place. How does the gospel fit into this? What does the gospel look like here? Can I just explain to you at the moment, for a great deal of people at Parihaka, like many Māori across the land, the Bible, the church, Christianity is the enemy in simple terms, because the narrative is what this has done to our people. And to, to bridge that, what I would call it in all truth, a simplistic but understandable analysis of the gospel and the church and mission, to bridge that is a very complex equation. So I find myself in there seeking to respond to that. And for many, many years, the response has been a silent response, mostly a silent response. Nothing to say, just to be here and to know that actually I'm learning way more than anything that I can bring. As I'm finishing up, there has seemed to me, in terms of my analysis, a turning, though, in that relationship, probably in the last couple of years. As I said earlier on, Parihaka is no paradise. If you go down there expecting paradise, you'll be very disappointed. You will find something unique and something special, but it is, like all of us, a flawed venture. Lots of internal issues. But one of the major issues is the place of the Bible. Where does the Bible sit now in their life going forward? And there are those that hold strongly to the Bible and actually represent it in a very forceful way, in ways that personally I don't find always most helpful. And there are those who I would say are probably the most influential, who have been saying for some time that the Bible has no place. But there has been a turning, and for now there is an invitation, as I mentioned earlier on around the question has come, is there a way that the Bible can fit in here that doesn't come like a hammer to destroy? Is there a way that the Bible can come and actually inform who we are as the followers of Te Whiti? And I would like to say or suggest that there is a way, but it's highly, highly complex. I think we need some more tohu. We need some more visitations in order to help us on that journey. Presently, the Pa is in the midst of a very exciting journey with the Crown after many, many years of being disenfranchised and not recognised by the Crown and not on any page with the Crown. There has come an engagement, and I just want to finish with that story now. As I said to you before, Parihaka is very different than the other places or iwi around the country, because it's organised not on whakapapa, on genealogy, but it's based upon kaupapa. So the Crown, by the legislation of the 1975 Waitangi Settlement Act, had given the mandate for the Crown to settle the grievances of the past with iwi. And so there was no place really for the Crown to negotiate under the legislation with Parihaka, because they refused to be seen within the Taranaka iwi as just a subset. They see themselves as a standalone people. So that has been going on for some time. And so I'm going to put some things out to you for prayer now. And one of the main things is that we have I think, a rather benevolent Minister of Treaty Settlements. His name is Chris Finlayson, who has found a way to put together a package for Parihaka to be invited to negotiate with the Crown on. And it's outside the treaty settlements, but it's based upon what they're calling a compact of agreement. And it's been done under the Attorney General's, I think the Attorney General's office, and they are looking to establish a way that they can actually support Parihaka under the title of reconciliation. And so that started earlier this year, and Parihaka have to get a lot of stuff organised in order to meet the requirements of the Crown. And just night before last, I was sitting in the meeting house at Te Pai, and we were going through some of these issues, sitting around doing PowerPoint discussions led by Ruakere on what this can look like. How do we organise ourselves in this meeting with the Crown? And so these are this very badly taken photograph. This was the first one, reconciliation, and here we are, he kōrero mā tātou. This is the discussion that we're all having around where we're going and discussing what is compact of trust, because ultimately Parihaka want to sign what I would call a covenant, but a compact of trust with the Crown based upon a whole lot of things. So it's a very exciting time, a very tense time, a very fragile time. A lot is going on, but I want to suggest to you, and some of you will know a photo of, this is Te Waka and Mata. I want to suggest that there is a possibility of Te Aranga. What that could look like, it's hard to say. It could just be a physical resurrection of a physical place. It could be the restoration of some people who are receiving the possibility to be able to rebuild their infrastructure despite the fact that they have lost all their land pretty well. Or it could be an aranga that actually also encompasses what, in my sense, was the deep tikanga or the deep things that Te Whiti and Tohu brought to the community of he nore ke te atua, mangorongo ke te whenua, whakarapai ki ngā tangata katoa. That's my tūmanako, that's my hope. Nō reira, kia koutou katoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.